Hey guys, welcome to this video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Uniswap. So what is Uniswap? Uniswap is a decentralized exchange that uses an AMM model. So what is a decentralized exchange? All right, a decentralized exchange is essentially a peer-to-peer marketplace that replaces an order book traditional model. So with a decentralized exchange, you can trade and swap between assets, but entirely on the blockchain. In order to do this, we need to use a new piece of architecture called the AMM, or the Automated Market Maker. An automated market maker essentially facilitates trades by having all of the asset that you want to trade between in two distinct pools. So instead of having a pair that you can trade between using an order book model, where people would post their trades to an order book and then the trades would be executed off that order book, an automated market maker facilitates those trades natively. And what do I mean by natively? I mean that we have an asset which is defined in terms of the other asset. So if we have X and Y, this is the abstract representation for an automated market maker, XY equals K, where X is one asset, Y is another asset, and K is essentially the aggregate value of those assets. So we can price assets in relationship to one another. So X can be priced in terms of units of Y, and Y can be priced in terms of units of X. And so as the relative abundance or the relative scarcity of these assets changes, that will shift us along this curve. So as apples become more scarce or pears become more scarce relative to apples, that will shift us on the curve, making, say, apples more expensive than pears if we value apples more than pears, or pears more expensive per amount of apples than apples are to pear if we value pears more. So simple and very intuitive. Now, I mentioned this term over there, liquidity pools. So what does that actually mean? Basically, liquidity pools are created by having individuals, they can be anybody, users of the blockchain, that go ahead and supply equal amounts of, say, ETH and USDC. And let's say they provide ETH and USDC. Traders, say, on the other hand of that, can go ahead and pay those people, those users who upfronted that liquidity. We call these people liquidity providers. They can pay those liquidity providers a 0.3% fee, for example, to switch between asset A and B, or between ETH and USDC. There is one problem with being a liquidity provider, and that is that you're exposed to something we call impermanent loss. So this notion of impermanent loss, this is really an unrealized loss that you occur if you are, say, provisioning two assets, and the value of simply holding both those assets would have been higher than if you had provisioned or given those to a liquidity pool. So what does this actually mean? Because we use a constant product making formula, if we have two assets, as a liquidity provider, the person who's providing liquidity to these pools in a 50-50 split, for example, of ETH and USDC, they are going to see the relative abundance of their assets change in the direction of the less valuable asset. And the reason is because traders are going to be buying or purchasing the more valuable asset, which is going to drive price up. And the reciprocal is also true. So if I have ETH and USDC and ETH becomes highly demanded and the price of ETH appreciates rapidly, the value, the total portion of ETH I have actually is going to start to decrease, because as a liquidity provider, I'm going to be selling people my ETH for USDC in return. And this might sound bad, but it can actually mitigate risk. So there is a way to use impermanent loss to your advantage. So we have a nice example of what impermanent loss might look like on the blockchain. So if we have 10,000 of these YLD tokens, we can see that the total amount of those tokens decreases because presumably the price went up from 30 cents to 35 cents. We can also see that the quantity, not the value, the quantity of USDT increases from 3,000 to 3,240.36. So we can see that, yeah, sure, the value of our position increased, but if we had just held, we would have actually made more value. So this is called impermanent loss. Hayden Adams, the creator of Uniswap, doesn't actually love the term impermanent loss, and he prefers unrealized loss, because that's really what it is. It's not a loss, quote unquote. It's you're missing out on a gain, but it's not even realized until you exit your position. The opposite could happen, and the price could flip, and you would make money on the reverse. So you're stacking that fee that you charge as a liquidity provider every time price has some move and people want to trade it or sell it. So flash swaps are another one of those weird quirks that we get when we build a new financial application on the blockchain. Now, because it's built on the blockchain, it's leveraging the properties of the blockchain, not of traditional financial infrastructure. So this gives it a character that's different. Flash swaps are cool. Basically, they allow you to leverage this component called atomic composability, which basically states that all of the transactions will either fail or succeed together. This allows you to borrow a huge amount of money in between block times. I got a cool graphical representation here of what a flash swap actually is. So normally you would go ahead and trade ETH for DAI and you do whatever you want with those DAI. But with flash swaps, you can go ahead and get DAI. You can do whatever you want with those DAI and then repay it within the same block time using atomic composability, which states that all the transactions fail or succeed together. And you only have to pay the fee if everything works out. But we haven't yet touched on this concentrated liquidity note I have here. This whole time, Uniswap has been very capital inefficient, and Uniswap actually succeeded in spite of this capital inefficiency. But Hayden Adams, the creator of Uniswap, he knew this, and he'd been working on something called concentrated liquidity, which was going to solve this. Instead of spreading out your liquidity and from zero to infinity, concentrated liquidity allows you to go ahead and bound your liquidity within a particular price range. So what does this mean? This means that instead of having a really inefficient liquidity pair where you give ETH and USDC in a 50-50 split, that liquidity is lost essentially from all the way from zero up to infinity. So if you do ETH USDC, you are providing liquidity when ETH is $0. Now the probability ETH goes to $0 is quite low. You're also providing liquidity technically for ETH at $100,000, $1 million, $10 million, and so on. And it causes a major inefficiency. Now, how do you get around this? The way you get around this is by bounding your liquidity in a price range. So Uniswap v3 allows you to go ahead and say, hey, I want to supply ETH and USDC, but I want to go ahead and provide ETH from the price point of, say, $500 all the way up to, say, $1,500 or $10,000. And within that given price range, you will make a higher proportion of all the transactional volume that happens within that price range. So that's impermanent loss in a nutshell, but there's a few properties that are kind of important to understand. So firstly, we have this property of non-fungible liquidity. So these pairs, when we make these on the blockchain, they're actually represented as an NFT. So you can contribute liquidity and set to say ETH and USDC at the given price range, $500 to $10,000 per Ethereum, or 500 USDC per ETH to 10,000 USDC per ETH. In that particular pair, that's represented as something called a non-fungible token, ERC-721, on the blockchain, and it can't be changed. It's permanent. So if you want to go ahead and have multiple positions, you can do that. And right here we see a nice graph of what a distribution of positions would look like on the blockchain. And so you can create many NFTs, and you can take liquidity out of those NFTs and reallocate it as you see fit. So now we're kind of introducing this notion of expressiveness to Uniswap. We're introducing this notion of essentially being able to create your own strategy. And that's really cool. It really changes the game. So we have this other kind of property down here called active liquidity. Now, we talked about that idea of impermanent loss right here. Uniswap v3 leverages that property. It's actually magnified more. Impermanent loss is actually, the risk of impermanent loss is actually increased for Uniswap v3. So when the price moves outside this bounded region over here, this is going to increase the amount of, we are going to be entirely converted to one asset or another. So we're going to be converted entirely to the less valuable asset or entirely to the less valuable asset if price moves in either direction. So if ETH is valued more than USDC, that's going to cause the price of ETH to appreciate relative to USDC. And if USDC is valued, say, more than ETH, the quantity of the relative value of USDC is going to be higher than ETH, and ETH is going to depreciate relative to USDC. And so you're going to be left with much ETH down here and more USDC up here. Uniswap v3 leverages this property of impermanent loss to create something we call active liquidity. And what active liquidity is it's basically saying that you go ahead and you use this property of impermanent loss to create active liquid positions. So liquidity is either in range or out of range based on price. And you can go ahead and understand that your position is going to change as the market changes. So active liquidity really describes the notion of impermanent loss that's expressed in V3. So with this notion of impermanent loss, you have liquidity providers who are agreeing to buy the less valuable asset when price increases. So if we have this bound right here and price moves down, we're going to be buying that less valued asset. And I don't mean valued in terms of dollars or ETH. I mean valued in terms of supply adjusted demand. So adjusted quantity, essentially. So if we have ETH and USDC and the relative quantity of ETH increases to USDC, we're going to be, as you would expect in impermanent loss, we're going to be buying the less valuable asset and selling our ETH. That's the agreement we made as a liquidity provider, and we take a 0.3% fee from that activity here. So active liquidity, right, describes this process. And active liquidity uses a couple of terms we call in range or out of range. We can see these down here, in range or out of range. And based on whatever the price is doing, we can say, hey, that's in range or that's out of range. And so we're not just thinking about our liquidity as a fixed position, as we would in, say, V2. We're thinking about it in terms of a particular instantiation of price that could exist along an entire continuum, and that we are going to make trading fees at a particular bounded interval within that continuum. So we can go ahead and leverage this notion of impermanent loss to create this third property called range orders. And a range order leverages active liquidity to create a continuous allocation from one asset to another across that bounded interval that we were just talking about. That's the bounded price. So as price action moves, say, into that range or out of that range, you're going to get a nice continuous allocation from asset A to, say, asset B. So this is a nice integration of many discrete orders that you might have to take if you wanted to slowly allocate. So this really does make the position more of an active, living type thing that is much more expressive. So that's Uniswap in a nutshell. There's a few key points that are important to consider here. I want to go over this analysis section I wrote down here. So basically, Uniswap is more than just DEX. It controls a large part of the Ethereum ecosystem, and it has something called the Uni Governance token. And this allows people to change the protocol based on governance, right? People can vote or decline different proposals that are made by Uniswap community members to change the protocol. And Uniswap has the ability to really facilitate a kind of decentralized finance that wouldn't be possible without it. Now, this notion of concentrated liquidity, expressive liquidity, this makes Uniswap quite unique. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens as the market evolves. Uniswap is a staple of much decentralized finance. I know, for example, I use Uniswap many times whenever I've bridged to L2s like Arbitrum or Optimism. Uniswap is usually the first place that I go. Convert my ETH to USDC or USDC to ETH, and I might buy or transact on those different L2s. Uniswap is also usually the first place that people come to when they start working. When they first get into Uniswap is also the first place that people are going to come across when they start using MetaMask and Web3 technologies for the first time. Probably be converting their ETH to USDC, and then perhaps using lending protocols, DeFi applications, participating in online NFT marketplaces, whatever their interest in Web3 is. Uniswap really is kind of one of those foundational technologies that's good to get a grasp on. So thank you for joining me today. We'll be having more graph style videos. We've been doing a lot of research, and I hope you guys enjoy.